Cheers.
I'm Derek Morrison, and welcome to a new episode of Bring Your Own. Southern France is home to some of the world's most classic and iconic wines across so many styles. We were excited to explore Provence, Chateauneuf du Pape, and some of the nearby regions with some fantastic winemakers whose own wines have taken great inspiration from some of these producers. Joining us today are winemakers Alex Krause and Johne Locke from Birichino Wines in California, along with author and winemaker Richard Bray. Special thanks to the great team at Locke restaurant in Farringdon who hosted us. One of London's finest Italian restaurants, we were fortunate to occupy one of their beautiful private dining rooms for our session. Find them online at locke.restaurant or on Instagram at locke.restaurant. If you enjoy the episode, please take a moment to give a review online. Follow us on social media at BYO Podcast and share this episode with your friends. Subscribe to the podcast to make sure you catch all future episodes. So, gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us today to celebrate some great wines from the south of France. Let's just go around and introduce ourselves quickly. We'll start with you, Richard. Tell us a bit about who you are, what you do.
My name is Richard Bray. I'm an author and winemaker and wine merchant based in London and the Roussillon. I've written a book on winemaking called Salt and Mold Vines, and I currently work harvest at Combe d'Almas and Mas Christine in Collier-Banyuls and Côte du Roussillon. I also sell wine at Hedonism Wines in Mayfair.
The Birichino gentleman, why don't you take it over from there and tell us a bit about what you're up to in California and why you're here with us today. What you got?
My name is Johne Locke. I have one job. That's why I feel like such a slacker. Alex and I co-founded Birichino in Santa Cruz, California in 2008. We worked together at another winery in Santa Cruz, known around these parts a little bit, Bonnie Doon Vineyard. But we started out just making a few wines of things less commonly encountered in California. Kind of lost self-control, a few years later, and make a lot of different things now. And sell them kind of around the world. Export about half the wine, so end up in London, generally once or twice a year. So.
Yeah, and I'm Alex Krause, the other half of Birichino, and we started our winery in 2008, as John mentioned, with the most unlikely of business plans, making a Malvasia Bianca and selling it all in your home country, in Quebec, to the government alcohol monopoly. And thankfully, it was actually thanks to Fields Morrison Verdun and Martine Bounet's gentle suggestion that we perhaps diversify our product range and make something red and maybe a rosé. Actually, two of the wines that we have on the table with us today. But we have, we're still a two-man operation: management, labor, winemaking, trucking, lots of trucking. You have two jobs. That's true.
Several hats under one big hat.
Yeah. But we own nothing. Have several hundred old barrels, make wine in an industrial estate in a not fashionable agricultural district, but are lucky to work with a lot of second, third generation Italian and French families that have wonderful 100, 120, 130-year-old vineyards, and try to do them justice.
I love your guys' wines. We've worked with them for a while, and what we have on the table today is a few. You make some Pinot Noir, you make some beautiful Pinot Noir, some Chenin Blanc, and the Malvasia, the Petnat from Malvasia. You've got a pretty broad spectrum of wines. But I remember when we met, one of the things that at first kind of connected with me about from your story was your love for the wines of Bandol and the south of France, and so that was kind of the inspiration when you guys were in Mutton. So, well, why don't we get these guys around the table and let's drink some fun wines from the south of France, and obviously that connects quite well to a few of the wines from your portfolio. So beyond obviously these three bottles, you have some great, as I said, Pinot Noirs, the ones that we work with a lot, and some of the other grapes I've mentioned. But why don't you tell us a bit about these three? We'll taste through quickly and then see what else you brought to share with us.
Yeah, we made Malvasia Bianca only that wine, 2008 and 9, and then 2010 started making rosé. We also kind of thought about. It's true. It was suggested to us that people were actually drinking red wine. What do you think? Who'd have thought? And we independently came not only to the same variety, but the very same vineyard. Actually, we wanted to work from. So that was the Grenache. The rosé has been very similar since we started making it, and it really is. I think we try to avoid the mistake of really copying exactly what other people do, but I was kind of alarmed to realize that 2017 was my 27th harvest or vintage, I think. And so we have made a lot of different wines in a lot of different places and tried a lot of different techniques, both on our own and other people's dime. So we try to borrow sort of ideas from other places, adapt it to the different vineyards, different climates that we have, and see if we can't make something that is not the same as our inspiration, but at least draws from the experience of other people. And this is a perfect example. This has always been Grenache, Old Vine Mourvedre, Old Vine Cinsault, and a little bit of Roll. Unfortunately, in California, or in the United States, it has to be Vermentino, because the first time it was put on a label, it was a Vermentino, but we call it Roll on the back, at least on the French version. So.
You got a big eyebrow raise from Richard over there, because you really tugged some heartstrings there, because I know he's got his Rock and Roll is the name of his Vermentino or Roll cuvee that they make in the restaurant. So immediate props from that you didn't see over your shoulder. But.
Well, when the in this vintage particularly, it has a kind of this whetstone kind of gunflint character, and we did say about this, it is much more rock than roll this year. So it is a very classic blend. It is something of a unusual method. We are very fortunate to be one of the 8 or 9 people that get grapes from the Bechtold vineyard, a very old vineyard out in Lodi, which Alex will tell you more about. Those grapes come in pretty early. It's a hot area as grapes go. It's maybe the least hot part of the Central Valley, but it's a very old vineyard, very adapted to the heat. We pick those grapes. It's the only lot of grapes we perform a saignée on. But we pick them with the intent of making rosé. So we pick them when the acidity is relatively high, potential alcohol is relatively low. Crush them, drain off some juice. Somewhat perversely, we make a red wine kind of as a byproduct of the rosé production. We settle the juice, goes into a tank, starts fermenting wild. 1, 2, 3 weeks later, another lot of grapes comes right, generally the Mourvedre. Those come in, we might crush them, give them some skin contact. Sometimes we'll go right to press, depends on the vintage. Juice settles, put it into the same tank. Keep the tank rolling. And then that's what we do with each successive lot that comes in. We'll start, typically late August. The wine goes dry in early December. So we neither encourage or discourage kind of malolactic, but if it happens, it goes through. It's not uncommon, it might go halfway through. But when it's dry, we kind of put the brakes on. So it does not go into barrel. Sometimes it does not go through malolactic, but it oftentimes has a lot of width. We think because you have this fermentation that's rolling a long time, you have this prolonged suspension of lees, and it just picks up this sort of richness, kind of almost glycerol quality. And it is a method that so far has not had any catastrophic failures. We really have found this, we've used basically the same percentages every year. It's about 2/3 Grenache, 15-ish, sometimes 12% Mourvedre or Cinsault, a little bit of Roll. And it's a little embarrassing, but the biggest piece of this is Grenache from up in the foothills, the Sierra foothills. Very high elevation, about 2,700 feet. Some grapes we probably would not make red wine from, which is fine, because we never have. That is oftentimes the second to the last piece. We've been using it since 2011, I think, 12, 11. I've never tasted wine, even that we've made, from that on its own. We've never peeled any of it off. I know how it tastes in here, or I know that we're happy with the results.
It's kind of late to the party, so it's kind of like get in the tank, get in there with the rest of it.
I
Go. It's November here.
If I thought about it, and especially now that it's memorialized on film, I think maybe we should have put some in a stainless steel, drum and see what it actually tastes like. But the grapes are so fresh; they have that wild strawberry kind of alpine quality, which alpine herbs and kind of violet pastilles shows up in so many of our wines for a variety of reasons. And the biggest component is the Grenache. That brings that alpine character to the wine. Sometimes a character shows up in the wine that is somewhat anomalous here or there. And oddly enough, we have no idea, not no idea, but can't be certain where it comes from because we've never tasted these wines on their own. They're not assembled post facto. It's called this sequential fermentation. So we think it's a good idea.
The result's always pretty good. I mean, I really like this rosé. It's got a lot of texture. It's got a lot of kind of sapidity. It's got a lot of personality, and I think it works really well. The price point. I mean, retailing it, it's a very successful wine. It doesn't hurt that it's beautifully packaged, but just as far as wine goes, I think it really delivers a pretty good punch for it. And you really see that style and that texture. It's much more. It's a serious wine. And you talked a bit about the Bechtel vineyard for the Grenache, where some of it goes into this rosé, and then maybe that's a good segue if you want to, Alex, start telling us a bit about the Grenache and then the Senzo.
We were lucky to work with this vineyard, and as John mentioned, in the first vintage, we used the entirety of the fruit for rosé, but it did seem to be almost criminal to take what we believe to be the oldest Senzo vineyard left on the face of the earth and just use it for rosé, no matter how lovely it may be. But it's, as John mentioned, from Lodi, not exactly perhaps the most fashionable of wine regions in California. More thought of as the place that you drive your trucks down from Napa in the middle of the night and load up on fruit and bring in 24.99% to blend into your wine from more fashionable, more trendy appellations. But nevertheless, it is an amazing source for some beautiful old vines, and this was planted by Joseph Spenker in 1886, and it's quite a trip to think about. Gustav Daimler was patenting the automobile, and the Statue of Liberty was arriving in New York Harbor, right around that same time period. That a lot has changed in the intervening years, and it's a rather special, almost kind of extraterrestrial kind of place. It's Tokay fine sandy loam, obviously ungrafted, dry farmed as well, and we're lucky. It's quite sought after, as you might imagine, although it wasn't always as fashionable grape variety, and went into, it was known as Black Malvoisie for quite some time, and was used for God knows what, for probably, hardy Burgundy and pink Chablis, and it's whatever passed, but it was really our Randall from Bonnie Doon who discovered the potential for it, and even at this is its 132nd vintage, it's still fairly productive. It yields a couple 3 tons even per acre. They're quite large individual berries and clusters, and we get our fruit from a later ripening section of the vineyard, which John mentioned, and I've always loved one of the top notes, that floral, kind of pretty violet lavender quality. Obviously has great natural acidity, is really the lift for the Vin Gris, but when made as a red, and as John mentioned, it's paradoxically the only red wine we make that we saignée at all. It's from one of the warmest regions that we work with, and it's almost always the lightest in body and the most sort of delicate. Just doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Doesn't look like a saignée red.
And it reminds us, I think, both of wines that we love from Beaujolais too, kind of Cru Beaujolais. It has that density of flavor and compactness and intensity, but on a lighter frame.
Light on its feet. I mean, it's amazing freshness and tension, and it's very linear at the same time. But then it has this. There's a lot of contrast in terms of the textures on the palate, but it's really quite chiseled, fresh, lively. It's eminently drinkable. I mean, it's so drinkable that you can just be hammering this back and not actually pay attention to how serious it is. But it's just so tense and nervy on the palate that it really kind of grabs your attention.
Yeah. I think there's kind of a holdover from the days in California when people were obsessed with hang time, and it was around the time that these large-scale wines were really being rewarded in the press, and there was a thought that people had to let grapes hang on. Like you're not going to get maximum flavor or proper wine unless you leave the grapes on. And I think Alex is right. This is the style of wine we like to drink. I do not like drinking like fatiguing, heavy wines. But I think there's a lot of vineyards in California that are just picked a lot later than they need to be. They lose their specificity. They might have some more width and weight and be kind of impressive, but the thing that might make them special disappears. It just fades off after a certain amount of time when you're kind of want lushness and kind of candied quality in the grapes. And so
This is 12 and a half or something like that, is that right?
it's about 12 and a half. Yeah, Grenache will occasionally get up in the high 13s and touch 14, but that's it.
We're acutely conscious of our good fortune that we get to work with such amazing old vineyards, organically farmed vineyards, dry farm vineyards, and so enjoy and appreciate their expressiveness and the unique qualities that they have, that they would be kind of blurred and homogenized if we followed a more typical protocol and worked them harder, did longer macerations. We don't do cold soaks. We don't, extend macerations, with one small exception on a portion of the Grenache that we ferment native. All of those things, I think, and we don't use new barrels, though we have purchased 4 in 10 years, but one of them sat empty for a year because we didn't actually have a wine to put into it.
Ostracized from the rest of the barrels. Don't go, please.
Yeah, but it's
Not
just
welcome here.
when you're lucky enough to have access to these amazing sources, and and it is our personal preference. Of course, we make wine in our own image. Certain sensitive New Age guys,
I just think one of the things that is lovely about this is how much more it reveals in the glass after time. Like there's, it starts incredibly soft and gentle, but the rusticity of Sanso begins to appear. The more air it gets, you begin to get a little bit of that grip and tension in the tannins, and it reveals different shades of the fruit as well. There's sort of a darker, almost like a citrus highlight to the red fruits and whatnot that comes out with a bit of time. It's really lovely.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you. I mean, that's for me a huge compliment, and we think about that a lot. And ideally, a more gentle, delicate, minimalist winemaking protocol allows for that kind of dynamic quality in the finished wine, that it's not a one-hit wonder that then trails off into the abyss, that hopefully with time, with air, you do reveal different layers, and you taste that both on the palate and its evolution
and you feel that even in the mouth, the different kind of chapters of the wine on the palate in terms of like what flavors it reveals. And the finish is it's nice, kind of like almost tobacco spice to freshness. I mean, you feel the high tone fruit, but then as you kind of see that rusticity, some of these kind of darker tones kind of sneak up on you a little bit. And that's what I kind of, part of when I said, like, it's so drinkable, it's so pleasant and enjoyable to drink, but then it's really like, it hangs around. I mean, it's got something to say.
It has a bit of a dual nature, which is, I should segue a little bit into the label is actually from our favorite Swedish artist from just north of Stockholm, Uppsala, who wrote a book on the history of the Nordic peoples, and this comes from a chapter, in fact, on the perils of navigation in above the Arctic Circle in the land of perpetual darkness or perpetual sunlight. And this has this kind of dual-faceted quality as a rosé and even, as a red wine. But there's a darker side and a lightness to it.
One other thing on that, and if we're going to make this a geeky winemaker episode, there is a lot of people confuse or do not make the distinction between like richness and density. And there's a point when the grapes mature and they get to the point where they have this level of ripeness that can still be fairly buoyant, but you get that density, and then you go a lot longer, then you could get into this richness and sweetness. And it's the density part that we like. So we say that our wines, oftentimes there's a lot of wine, but in a condensed space. We don't want a lot of wine in a expansive space that kind of fatigues it. We want them concentrated downward, kind of. And
I think that's a really good kind of, it kind of reaches to what we're going to taste later in some of the wines from south of France and Chateauneuf du Pape, and wines that really find that equilibrium between concentration and density and intensity of flavor, while maintaining this ethereal, balanced quality. And I think at times, being able to achieve that balance and hit that perfect point where you maximize both aspects of that, maintaining that levity and intensity at the same time, is it's such a small target, such a small bullseye, it's such a fine line to straddle in hot climate regions, especially where you work, where you work, and where the wines we're going to talk about for. So whenever it hits that right note, for me, it's quite profound. So with that, now we've got the Grenache in front of us.
The Grenache, yeah. So this is from a vineyard planted on its own roots in 1910. It's been farmed for much of that since just after World War II by the Besson family. Their patriarch, Johne, moved from the Savoie to California, happened to land in San Francisco. The big earthquake hit, and then they headed south until his wife didn't want to keep moving any further, and they set up camp in right at the base of the Santa Cruz Mountains on the inland side. And then just after World War II, Jean's son, George Sr., purchased this vineyard, which was already 30 years old. But it's unusual in many respects. It's a fairly large vineyard. It's about 10 acres, almost all of that original, from the original planting. It's gently north sloping, fairly sandy, granitic soil, a little bit of clay in there. And at the confluence of three mountain ranges, you have the Santa Cruz Mountains on the western edge, through which there's a gap, the Hecker Pass Gap, where you do get some fog, some coastal influence from the incredibly deep, 4,000 meter deep Monterey Bay, just on the other side of the hills, that keeps the nights quite fresh. And you have it's not irrigated, it's dry farms, and it's warm enough in that location, just about a mile from the start of the Santa Cruz Mountains, to ripen quite completely, but still cool enough to preserve more delicacy and more fragrance. And we've known and worked with this vineyard in past lives for quite a few years, but when Martine from Fields Morrison Verdun at the time suggested we really should make a red wine, this was the first thing that popped into our minds, and got lucky that we now get to draw on it. And you mentioned kind of talking about hang time, and then kind of the prevailing wisdom when we started was that you wanted to let things really go and develop. And I think we both have made a shift towards trying to pick as early as possible, in a way. While this vineyard we've gotten to know probably the most profoundly of any of the sites that we work with. We do pick it in it's in 8 different blocks, and we've come to know that block 1 by the highway is typically more forward, quite the earliest ripening, and blocks 2 and 3 have quite a bit more rocks and thicker skins, higher tannin. We pick that a little bit later. We are looking to kind of keep that balance, that tension, that freshness, and it has a really special purity of flavor and a transparency that kind of has almost, for me, like an auditory quality that it really rings, and we do everything possible to preserve that. Given that we're not doing a kind of typical saignée, we're not doing cold soaks, we're not extending macerations. Typically, we'll pick this after a couple days. The native ferment kicks in, and after a couple of weeks or so, taste it. When it tastes dry, we'll press it off and put it down to a combination of demi-muid and barrel, and more recently into some cement. But all of those things kind of give you that delicacy, that elegance that we look for. But since 2012, we go through and personally pick, and we're very slow, about 10% of our Grenache, looking for really loose, open clusters with good airflow. pick them into FYBs, as we call them, the yellow boxes, and bring to a barn on the property, and in the dark put fans on them and dry them for 10 days to 2 weeks, and then ferment that lot separately. And on that one piece, we do an almost biblical 40 days and 40 nights extended maceration, and blend that back in as our kind of secret sauce into the main lot. And what I love about that is that it seems unlike, and we've tried, since we work with Old Vine, Chateau sitting right next to it, and Old Vine Mourvèdre, we have tried blending other things into this Grenache, but each time we've done that, it felt like it really blurs that precision, the focus. But by doing this short appassimento piece of the Grenache, it seems to amplify the kind of wild, sappy quality, this sort of Christmas in northern Michigan aspect to this vineyard without blurring that focus. And certainly it contributes some tannin and length on the palate.
So Alex, one of the first things that kind of we connected on as co-wine lovers was a mutual appreciation for wines from kind of south of France and from Provence and there. And so this kind of segues nicely into what I see in front of us that you brought. So you want to just tell us a bit about what you brought and why you brought it?
Sure. So I brought the Reynald de Lille's Terrebrune Bandol, and I really owe my interest and passion and now career in wine to Provence. Had the good fortune to have spent some months and actually years as a student in the south of France, living with a French family who were tangentially involved in the wine business, but they exposed me to late 70s vintages of Vieux Telegraphe and Daube Provençal and what great rosé could be. And so Bandol has always been a kind of close to my heart, and I am a huge fan of what he's managed to do, what his family, he and his father before him, in Bandol. And this is certainly an inspiration for both of us, I would say, for what we do. It's about half Mourvèdre and roughly a quarter each of Grenache and Chateau on limestone. Yeah, it's aged in some old food. He does let it go through malolactic, but it, to me, proves that you can have a fantastic, fresh and structured wine that's a rosé that is long-lived as well.
I think that the last part you touched on, the longevity of these wines, is one of the things that is so important for people to understand, especially people who are kind of new to wine or have a very kind of non-serious perception of rosé wines. I mean, tasting some aged Bandol is just like, it's like a whole other thing. It's just funny to me. I can't think of another region in the world that has such a disparity between like the ceiling of the wines and like the mass perception of the entry level of the wines. And I don't know if you notice any differences.
So I had one of my jobs a couple of years ago was to go find a new Provençal rosé for the wine importer that I worked for. And so I was at Vinasud, and in one morning with a winemaking friend of mine named Nyan, who's a friend of yours as well, we tasted through about 150 Provençal rosés, and it was absolutely horrifying because they were, I've later discussed this with other people. There's so much at the high volume level that it's just an enologous stream, because they're trying to do it in such volumes that something that should be very, very, very simple is made incredibly complex, because they're cold stabilizing, they're pumping loads of enzymes, they're not using native yeasts, because they basically have a Dulux color palette that they have to hit, and it has to be exactly the same no matter what, and it has to somehow be bone dry while still having enough residual sugar that people will really like it. And so, and then at the same tasting, I went to taste some of the Bandol rosés and rosés from producers who really do it right. And I mean, as these guys know, rosé is should be just red grapes picked a little bit earlier from sometimes younger vines, pressed gently so you get a bit of color from the skins, and then just treat it like wine after that. There shouldn't be any messing about with it.
Well, I'm just going to say something. You said you don't have to make it complicated, and you said it's not difficult, and
It is really hard.
we make
We're a total non-winemaker.
well, no, but we make a very clear distinction between these two continuums of complexity and difficulty, and so what those guys are doing, it's really complicated, but it's actually easy. Once you know how to do it, making those things, there's a lot of complicated steps, but it's really easy. And these things, and I'm not going to claim like we're the greatest winemakers in the world at all, but making what we do is actually conceptually simple, but it's difficult. Like getting them at the right point, figuring out if there is some phenolic character in the grapes that you don't want in the wine, or if you do want in the wine, or how much width is the right amount of width, how to get the length, how to keep it nervous and have the right texture. And so like it's really conceptually simple, just difficult to find that right point.
It's made more complicated by the fact that they're trying to scale it to such an industrial level that you're competing against what nature gives you. If you interpret what nature gives you, and you can read it in a sense, and your concept is sound, the execution has to be precise, and technically it has some technical difficulty. But you're not fighting against what's optimal. You're trying to work with what's optimal and then to execute it to the best possible level. And what's interesting about Provence, because you see this problem with that mass industrialized wine in. We've seen it destroy fine wine and Prosecco. We've seen it really kind of set Chianti back. We saw it send Soave back, Malbec. Anywhere where we've seen a mass consumption or mass demand for a lowest common denominator product from a single region, how it sets back the fine wine market demand in some of those things. I mean, I say to people all the time, there's nothing harder to sell in wine than like a 40-pound bottle of Prosecco, like from a single site. Like that's just, it's so difficult to sell. Not because the wine isn't of that quality, but because the market perception of the value of that appellation is diminished by industrial wines. And what's interesting about Provence is that Bandol and say Palette, for example, because I think they have their own individual AOCs, that really helps them segment a bit from some of the sludge in a sense. I mean, it's still very niche and you still have to find a way to achieve, but I think that they're able to differentiate enough. Bandol has its own separate brand to Provence, in a sense, and I think that's interesting and important, but the ceiling of these wines, and this wine definitely demonstrates, it's really the seriousness of what you can achieve there. So I think it's really cool. Great choice.
Thank you. Yeah, it's at least in the U.S. And I imagine in the U.K. as well, that there's this bifurcation of expectation for what rosé should be. That it should be, I think majority of people just don't even think about it. It's just something to quaff and quick and easy and simple, that you can have something with great structure, with great longevity, with complexity, with really, in many respects, all of the structure and the body of a red wine, but just with that freshness and that elegance and that flexibility as well.
I think what we've seen in the market too is that as people kind of go more and more towards drinking reds, we've seen this, and the rosé in season demand goes up. That's kind of extended to this kind of year-round demand for more serious roses, and I think that's kind of helped in a sense. And we're seeing, for me, I can speak to what I sell in the shops and how I've expanded the range. I'm selling much more rosé from Etna, from Corsica, from Germany, different types of, real wines that just happen to be rosé. And I think that there's just the freshness in this style helps kind of, I'm never not in the mood for rosé, personally. It's kind of a good opening act to whatever I'm gonna have next, and maybe that's a good segue to kind of get to the next bottle.
Sure.
I brought a bottle of the 2011 Trevallon Blanc, which is much more rare than the reds, red. And so why don't let's get a bit in the glass here for you guys, and we'll talk a bit about it and see what we think. So Trevallon Blanc is predominantly Marsanne with some Roussanne, a little bit of Chardonnay, Grenache Blanc, and Claret. And I had reached out to the Durbach family a few years ago, and trying to see trying to get an allocation for Canada, or I just want to have the wine on my list, basically. But yeah, so just to kind of give you an example of the scarcity of this wine, if you want to import, when I spoke to the Durbach family, for every 12 bottles of red you buy, they'll allow you to buy 1 bottle of white. So for every case of 12, you need to buy 120 bottles of red. So and that's why the red is kind of super. So for people who don't know the estate, the Durbach family, Monsieur Durbach's father was actually a friend of Picasso, and he's an artist, and he settled his family with an estate in Provence. And when his son took over the estate and started working with planting vines, what's unique, they're in Provence, but they were kind of just a Vin de France. They were not part of the appellation. He was doing reds, 50% Cabernet, 50% Syrah, planted on north-facing granitic slopes on the family estate. And I always think of Trevallon as kind of the super Tuscan of the south of France in that sense, where it was really going for his own approach and doing something very unique, which nowadays you see so many people trying to do kind of replications or a similar kinds of wines. But the wines are timeless. The reds need tons of age before they really start to open up. And the price, quality, value in terms of iconic wines of France, I just think that it's always absolutely stunning. And anytime I'm buying for the shops, or I'm buying for restaurants, or whatever I'm doing, anytime I come across some vintages of Trevallon Blanc that has even a semblance of age on it, I buy it. Kind of the price will work, whatever it is. And it tends to be a bit more expensive than the red, but still, in terms of wine that's almost got a decade of age for a white, it's just such a cool wine. There's so much texture, so much intensity. I just love this domain, and I just think there's a lot of really cool stories about the family and what they've been doing at the domain. And it's always been just a domain that I have a lot of excitement for personally. And I think when we're talking about wines from this region, it's really cool to kind of showcase one of these bottles, because it's so different from some of the stuff that we're going to taste and that we've tasted, but equally important, I think, to telling the whole story of Provence or the south of France. So
I think it's delicious, and there's like a lot of times you have like 3 elements or 4 elements like you think are critical in the wine to make it complete, and if there's 3, you can get 2, but like you can get any 2 of the 3, but getting all 3 and having something that's rich and textured but is still mouth-watering, that's tough. And this has that almost salty character. You almost like wonder, is there like 15% Chenin in here or something like that to richen it out? And it gives that salty, and it keeps it alive. And then it's like it's a lot of wine, and not in a small space, but it's not tiring or lazy at all. It's really alive and vif and but rich.
It's got that salinity or like almost like pork belly fat. Like it's got this kind of savoriness to it. But Marsanne also is kind of for me, it's a difficult grape for me to like and want to drink, because it's so spicy, and it's got a really kind of enigmatic personality as a grape. So it's kind of but this wine is just, as you say, it's definitely, I think, better than any individual part, but it's got that richness, it's mouth-filling, but it's still fresh, it's got salinity, but it's, and I think alcohol level, it really holds itself quite well, 13.5, it's...
Everything about it suggests it should be fat, and it's not fat in any way, shape, or form, because everything is where it's supposed to be. It's just, and there's so much of, like, when I say everything, there's so much going on in there. I've always thought Trevallon should have its own AOP, sort of like, I think it deserves it more than Gruyere does, because it's just totally different from everything around it. And even though lots of people sort of try to copy it, and you have people like, different but the same, but like Domaine Gassac and Grange de Père and stuff like that, they're easily the cream of the crop of all of those, of the sort of, it feels disingenuous to say the new south of France, because they've been around for a long time, but that sort of the pioneers of making the south of France seem more serious to wine drinkers from around the world. I think their wines are just awesome. I think this is.
You know, and you mentioned Grange du Pape, and he went, when he was starting to kind of develop for his wine, he went and he spent time with 2 winemakers to kind of get a perspective on how to grow Syrah. He went to Johne and he went to Durbach at Trevallon, and I think that's kind of pretty cool. But yeah, I mean, it's funny though. It's funny when I was planning this episode, I was so psyched that you were into wines from this area, and we've got some really cool stuff behind this. And Richie brought something great to the table. I talked to a few people, and I talked to somms around the industry, and everyone was kind of like, yeah, I mean, cool, but nobody was really as hyped as I was, because, I mean, I guess it's just not.
Warm climate's not popular these days.
That's the thing. Warm climate's not popular, and it just blows my mind, because just because it's a warm climate doesn't mean the wine's going to be massive. And for me, wines that are, even if they are massive, that retain that elegance within that is what is, I think, really exciting to me. I mean, we talk about Trevallon. We've got, I mean, not to give away what we're going to taste soon, but. You know, producers like Henri Bonneau. I mean, Henri Bonneau is one of, I think, the top 20 domains on the planet. It doesn't matter where they're from. I mean, I absolutely have great reverence for the wines that he made and now that his son's making in Chateauneuf du Pape. And I mean, they're wines in these. Obviously, you guys are in California. You're in the capital of abused vineyards in terms of like overworked, over-extracted, overdone hot climate wines that are, you know, what we can say they're chasing points, or that they're the darlings of these kind of opulent styles of wine. Chateauneuf du Pape is kind of equally guilty of having overworked some of those wines, but at their peak, at the best examples, there's so much finesse. I mean, even wines that I've had bottles of, like Hommage from Beaucastel, 15%, you know, 95% or 90% Mourvedre, and it's intense, but there's just so much balance. And when a wine's in balance and that alcohol doesn't spike, and it's just at home with whatever's been created, it doesn't matter if it's really 13, 14, 15, if it's the wine is been made at its best.
We make wine, not to push the Birichino thing, but we make wine up in the Chalon AVA, Provence. And that is and you drive up there, it's basically high desert, it's bone dry, it looks like a Wild West, sort of a scene for a spaghetti western. And you kind of go up there and think, you know, this would be pretty cool for Morvad.
There's an extinct volcano.
On there. And it is freaking hot. It is really hot, but it's really cold at night. And the fact that, you know, not to get too geeky, but if this is really on some north face, and if there's that shift, there's some sort of, if you have a high difference, a diurnal shift, and that makes all the difference up there. You can make wines in this hot climate from Pinot Noir, which should not really doesn't make any sense.
So Richard, while we're pouring, do you want to tell us a bit about what you brought for us and why you brought it?
So when I was told the remit was south of France, I racked my brain about what I wanted to bring, and I was not just regarding sort of producer, but also color. I think I decided in the end on a red because you'd said that we had a white and a rosé and one other red, and I thought, oh, I'll do a red, and I chose Terre de Chardons, who are a biodynamic organic producer in the Costières de Nîmes, and I have a funny relationship with the Costières de Nîmes. Very famous in the UK for just being cheap and really good value. This is not one of those. This is a quality producer. But about 8 years ago, the appellation did a massive project where they sent a bunch of wine bloggers 3 blind wines to work out what they were on their websites. And so, not having any idea of what the appellation was, I'd guessed further up the Rhone, but I tasted them blind, and I thought it was an interesting experiment. I don't think it went well because I don't think, from what I understood, I think of the 70 people that had been sent the bottles, no one had, only maybe 1 or 2 people had got it right. The region didn't seem to have an identity yet, and I think that's changing now. It's one of those places where quality wine is growing, and this is on the more natural side of things for my tastes, but I really love the producer. I was on a buying trip with my old company last year, and one of my colleagues at the time dragged me over to the table saying these are pretty fantastic. So this is 2015 vintage, quite ripe, 80% Grenache, 20% Syrah. This is their Bien Lune. It's their more vin de soif wine, so it's much more their sort of, easy drinking, light. Obviously, you can tell it's pretty cloudy. There's no funning or filtering on this. But it's still, I really liked it because there's a juiciness and a definition of fruit that a lot of wines of this style from this part of the world can often lack in favor of being that much more authentic and or natural, in inverted quotation marks.
God,
It's beautiful.
yeah, it really looks. It looks like Grenache someplace. It smells to me. It smells like Syrah to me. It tastes like it's just a totally.
Costierdenime always does that to me. So one of the reasons why I got all the blind bottles that they sent me, I thought they were all Syrah, and all the blends were 80 Grenache, 20 Syrah. And then they do another cuvee, actually. I think it's called the Madrigal, which is reversed. And the Syrah is just massive. So I guess their Syrah is super high octane because you do get that, and they're not co-fermented. They're during vinification the Grenache is treated very reductively. The Syrah is treated quite oxidatively in the relative sense. I think they make beautiful wines. And this is actually a wine from the south of France that I know at least one sommelier loves. Bastien from Frenchy is a huge fan of Terre de Chardons. So
there's one sommelier who likes one wine from the south of France, and the others.
Put it on the board.
And he's French.
Well, it's beautiful. It's amazing. It's great because we tasted your Grenache. We really see the varietal character in the wine. But as you say, that 20% Syrah, it just punches through with this matte, bulldozer of savoriness. It's just got this kind of really this meaty character comes through. Which I really like because it kind of works like this kind of blonde tobacco aspect of the Grenache, and then that really bright high tone fruit. It's just a really cool wine. It's 13%. It's really quite, again, drinkable.
Very quaffable. It's I really like these wines. I bought a mixed case after that trip, and I think I'm gonna have to restock. I think they're the sort of bottle. Having a bottle of this at the ready in the house is, I think it's a good thing to have.
Consumers get confused by the vocabulary in winemaking a lot, and it's there's such odd descriptors that are attributed to wines. Woolly Chenin Blanc. What the fuck does that mean? But then you taste 10 wines, you know what you mean. But the first time that is ridiculous. But there are a lot of wines. I do not like wines that are have vegetativeness. But there's a term that's almost identical. We say botanical, and I love wines that are botanical. They taste like those tinctures. They taste like somebody's dripped in a little bit of Barolo Chinato in them, and that shows up a lot in south of France, and it is very different than that full-on black cherry or the confiture, the confité quality, which is impressive kind of early on and then gets really boring. But these sorts of wines, they stay interesting much longer. They're much more interesting, and I just love that flavor, and it just has a different dynamic.
And this is a good segue to the next wine that we're going to taste, which I think we've all been excited to taste today, because I can see people's eyes keep looking over there.
Making sure it's still there.
Yeah, but from your Grenache, this one with obviously the Syrah, we've kind of identified what's quite pronounced in its influence in this wine. But seeing your expression of Grenache Birichino in California, this Grenache predominant wine, and then how it kind of segues to what we're going to finish with, I really like the harmony and the way that the Grenache is expressed, because so often it's a grape that can also be, as you've kind of just touched on, really worked and overly concentrated to make these opulent, I call them bodybuilder wines. that it's more of an exercise in like how opulent can I make this, as opposed to like what's the right balance or level within what's going to be the most pleasant for my palate, at least within that. And I think we're kind of climbing up the going to that mountain and of what that's going to be. And I think it's Grenache is, and because of the big point scoring wines, whether they're Grenache and Priorat or some over big ripened Grenache in Chateauneuf du Pape or southern France or wherever, I just as a grape, I mean, you guys maybe can speak to your opinions on the grape, working with it more than I drink it, you make it and grow it, right? So I'm aware of the difference in perspectives, but I think it's one of those misunderstood grapes in terms of it's too often associated with these big opulent wines, and it's like, oh, it's big alcohol, it's low tannin, it's this and that, it's the other side of the Mediterranean's Zinfandel or Primitivo in a sense, whereas it's such a, I think at its best is much more Pinot-like in terms of like its expression, this beautiful, there's always this natural, I always think blonde tobacco contrasts with like high tone, like red fruit. And I think that natural intrinsic flavor that's already there when you kind of don't mask it with this like over concentration or overworking of it, that it's really pretty. And then you combine that with some really cool terroir and a bit of other kind of variables, or whether it's blending or whatever else is happening with it, you get these really elegant, profound, ethereal wines that are kind of pushing you and pulling you in so many different directions that they're really, I don't know who couldn't like or appreciate or celebrate those wines. And it's, again, what I've said earlier, it surprises me whenever people aren't quite as enthused about it. So John, you've got something pretty special to conclude our evening for us today. It's an up-and-coming producer from the Chateauneuf du Pape.
A new guy, first vintage, kind of a nouveau style sort of thing. We at Birichino, we make, as I mentioned, Pinot Noir, and we have a very strict prohibition of mentioning, what we call the B word, the place in France where they make Pinot Noir. People in California love to talk about how their, Pinot Noirs are Burgundian. It makes me nuts. And we never do it. We never would do it. We're not trying to make Burgundy. It doesn't taste like Burgundy. That being said, we freely admit in Grenache, there's this thing that we kind of look towards. And it's not that we make a wine that is at this level or should be compared to it, but it is, we can aspire to this sort of model, and the vineyard is set up, from which we make Grenache, to do something in that style. And I love this wine. I was just like imagining like a few minutes ago in California, it's after January 1st when pot is legal now. So we got the email from somebody and said, decide on some wine that you guys want to have poured. And I was imagining a couple, guys back in the room like, hey, let's ask for Rayas. They'll never do it, but. So we didn't have Rayas, but we got this wine made by same family, Raynaud family. One of the oddities in Chateauneuf, they make basically 100% Grenache wines here, and then up in the property in Vaccaras. And I'm not going to pretend like I can describe the last 34 vintages of Rayas because, I'm lucky enough. I was also a wine buyer, and I got to go to the Martine's tasting. She imports the wines into the U.S., and I get to taste them and occasionally drink them there on somebody else's dime. But taste the wines from up at the Domaine des Tours. They're either the Vaccaras, the Côte d'Aron, or they're VDP. They're little wines. All through their range, they are perfumed. I never feel like they're heavy, or they're intended to be heavy. They're fruity. They have this liqueur quality in Grenache I love, but they always have, again, that botanical quality I love. They can be funky sometimes, but when they're pure, they're just the perfume and the texture and the just prismatic character of the aromas, the fruit and the spices and all those things. I love them. One of my favorite kind of groups of wines in the world. I wish I was the real baller and I could buy the real thing. but I would say this is the type of thing we really. You talk about a wine that's an inspiration. Not having tasted it yet, I'm gonna like still be it's still levitating to me because I'm just looking at it. This is kind of my inspiration. I think I speak for Alex. He likes them well.
That's your hang in there kitty poster at the end of the winery when you're
exactly yeah.
Rocking.
The Farrah Fawcett Majors poster up on the wall. I could have a girlfriend like that.
While you're like racking the Grenache, you got Rocky's Eye of the Tiger and like staring at a Rayas poster.
Yeah. Except we do clean the barrels, so I don't know. Sorry, did I just?
I mean, it's cool, and one of the things that it's kind of a common theme in the episodes we have when we're tasting great wines. It's kind of I'm always obsessed with kind of the enigmatic characters of the wine world, the kind of the quirky eccentrics that make wines that are so amazing, and that they're always a bit quirky. Rayas is kind of one of is perfectly fit to one of those, and I think Jancis has a great story about like going to Rayas and trying to get a visit, and for Jancis Robinson to try to get a visit somewhat difficult. And speaking to the importer former managing director who had said, he said, I organize 2 visits a year to Chateau Rayas. Yours for Jancis Robinson and his own. And that's it. That's the only other, those are the only appointments he can get. And it's, they don't have a phone, or they didn't have, like they had a phone, they didn't have an email, they didn't have a fax machine. It was this kind of archaic kind of domain that you send letters and hope and pray kind of thing. But and this is the 2009. This is the current release. They hadn't released a wine since 2014. And so Pignan obviously is the second wine of Chateau Rayas. My allocation of Chateau Rayas this year was 3 bottles, and it was gone by the time I got on the bus and before I got off the bus. All 3 bottles had kind of been scooped up before they even arrived at the shop. But so I mean, what's interesting about Pignan, what's interesting about Rayas' wines is that their soil. I mean, Chateauneuf du Pape is mostly famous for the kind of the Galais soil, right? And Rayas is on this kind of decomposed, sandy rock, very iron-rich sand and very like red sand soils. But there's not a stone in sight kind of thing, and which is interesting because I always, when I think of wines that are on that kind of sandy soils, I'm always afraid that without that added layer of depth on the mid palate that brings from some of the Galais soils, that sapidity, that it can very much what you said, similar to the schist in in Roussillon, can really mask and kind of absorb a lot of the heat and other kind of things that can happen, can come from growing in such a hot site and absorb that alcohol. And this wine has nothing. There's nothing to mask anything. It's like what you see is what you get. Like it's either going to be precise or it's not. And this wine's sings. I mean, it's just beautiful.
I get loads of really good Barolo notes from it at the moment as well. Just at where it is, I think that's more of a developmental phase, but there's that petrichor, that sort of rain on hot asphalt tarriness, particularly towards the end of the mid palate, that you get that almost burnt stone quality, which just it comes out of nowhere because you don't get it on the nose, but it's still incredibly integrated. That's an amazing one.
Yeah, it just clicks through these different things. Oh, there's this flavor. It's like a little meaty. Oh, there's this cherry liqueur. Oh, there's this fennel.
Chateau earlier.
Chateau, there's botanical extracts. Yeah, they just go through all these different things. And it's, again, people think of Chateauneuf, this big, lush, heavy wines. It is so not big and heavy, but you could not, fault it for, so it's not missing any pieces. It's just really, really lovely texture.
Guys, thanks so much for sharing this special bottle. I mean, this is really a fitting way to wrap up the theme today, and it's very rare that, well, not very rare. Sometimes it can be a challenge for a wine to live up to the hype of itself based on its own kind of its own reputation. But I think this bottle is definitely fit to its name. And thank you so much for sharing your wines, your story, and your own appreciation for the wines of this region and how it's kind of inspired what you guys are up to in California. And thanks to everyone here at Luca Restaurant for hosting us, and look forward to sharing some more bottles with you guys again soon.
Here, here.
Cheers.
Cheers. Cheers. I'll drink Pignan anytime.
Yeah, I can't wait for that token as
Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please take a moment to share a review online or share the episode with your friends.